started now. I'm just going to make a note that the people who are on Zoom, if you would like to leave any questions, please leave them in the chat, and then I'll be happy to facilitate questions in the Q&A session at the end of the talk. But thank you very much for joining us today, and especially to the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies, the Jeremiah Lecture Fund, and the Global Justice Program, and as well as the Anthropology Department for contributing to Nam Kim's visit. And I'm really glad to have Nam Kim here again for our second lecture of the day. He was again supposed to be here in January and was unable to make it, so we're really glad that he's been able to come in person and give his lectures now. So he's a professor. Dr. Nam Kim is a professor of anthropology at University of Wisconsin-Madison and also director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. He received his PhD from the University of Illinois in Chicago in 2010, and his dissertation was on the underpinnings of sociopolitical complexity and civilization in the Red River Valley of Middle Age Vietnam. He began undertaking research in Vietnam and fieldwork in Koloa in 2007, and he's written on this work, including The Origins of Ancient Vietnam, a monograph published by Oxford University Press in 2015, and that was the subject of his talk this morning. And he also published recently with Mark Kissel a monograph on emergent warfare and our evolutionary past, which will be what he's talking about this afternoon. And that was published in 2018 by Routledge Press. And then, as we were just discussing, he just recently published a co-edited volume with Charles Hyam on the Oxford Handbook of Early Southeast Asia. In addition to these, he's also published in a variety of peer-reviewed journals, including African Archaeological Review, the Journal of Archaeological Research, Asian Perspectives, and in Vietnamese in the Archaeological Journal of the Vietnam Academy of Social Sciences. He's gotten funding for his work from the National Science Foundation, Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, the Henry Luce Foundation, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, among others. And in addition to his fieldwork in Vietnam, he's also done World War II MIA recovery in France, worked on Mayan sites in Mesoamerica, and at a Neolithic linear bond ceramic site in Belgium. And he's also, I can personally attest to being a wonderful colleague and mentor who's published a lot with some of his former students. And as we heard this morning, he also has a family history with warfare in Vietnam, which has inspired some of his archaeological research on these topics. And so we got to hear about the Vietnam side of his work, which definitely dovetailed with the topic of warfare. But now he's going to be going into more detail about thinking about warfare more broadly in humanity's past. And so I'm really glad to have him talk on this subject this afternoon. So once again, on chat, or please, if you're on Zoom, leave your questions in the chat box, and then we'll have time for a Q&A from the audience here. So I'll hand it over to you, Nam. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison, and thank you for being here today. I'd like to thank Allison and Tung and the Global Justice Program, the Center for Asian Pacific Studies, and the Anthropology Department for extending this invitation. It's a privilege for me to be here today. So to kind of continue from this morning a little bit, the impetus for a lot of my research has been my family history, and I'll just start with that kind of background. But as I mentioned this morning, I am of mixed ancestry. I joked that how I was sort of of barbarian ancestry, at least from the eyes of the Chinese civilizations, the Central Plains. But my father is Korean and my mother is Vietnamese, and both of them were affected from very early ages by conflicts in their respective countries. They were displaced as very young people. Their families were displaced from their ancestral homelands, and eventually they met each other in Vietnam, and that's where I was born. I was born in Saigon in 1974, and they met each other during the middle of a different conflict and found themselves escaping as refugees one more time, this time with each other. That's me with my mother. This is off the coast of Vietnam. This is near Vung Tau, right off the coast outside of Saigon. And it's the day after we left. We were evacuated by helicopter off the top of the USAID building, and then eventually got out to the coast, and from there across the South China Sea, also known as the Eastern Sea, to the Philippines, then ending up in refugee camps in Guam, and then eventually in the United States. So have been hearing stories from my family about conflict and how conflict pushed our trajectory, our lives from different places across the Pacific all the way to the United States. So I would not be here had it not been for Cold War events, in the 20th century, all of the changes geopolitically that happened. And so I've been fascinated by these kinds of narratives and by the phenomenon of warfare. This was something that I wanted to study from a very young age. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized I was interested in some of the earlier manifestations. Because the bigger question for me is, when do we start to see humans fighting? What were some of the earliest manifestations of organized violence between groups of people? And some of the work that I'm going to be talking about today rests on very, very diverse bodies of data from different global regions, different histories. And a lot of these debates, as you'll see, kind of hinge on different kinds of interpretations of the same data sets. And they lead to very different, very divergent perspectives and interpretations. And if you want to put it in a nutshell, you could say some see a short chronology, some see a long chronology. And what I mean by that is how far back in time we go in terms of the origins, if we can even say something about origins. And the other thing that I would say about this is everybody has an opinion about this, whether you study it, whether you've heard about it, whether you look at the news or you have family members that have experienced conflict in some way, everybody has an opinion about this. And this includes my late advisor. So Dr. Larry Keeley, who was a professor at University of Illinois, Chicago, he wrote a book back in 1996 called War Before Civilization. And his book came about at a very important time because in his estimation, a lot of archaeologists had kind of glossed over evidence for conflict in the distant past. And he was writing a kind of critique where he accused, maybe he could have been more diplomatic in how he approached it, but he accused people of failing to look hard enough, failing to acknowledge the possibility that other kinds of societies, not the so-called states or civilizations of the more recent past, and other kinds of societies were also capable of conflict and warfare. And this heavily influenced a lot of my thinking. And this has led to my own work on this topic. And my colleague, Mark Kissel, and I produced this monograph a few years ago. This is sort of the book I wish I had when I was starting to look into these topics. When I was in undergrad, when I was starting off in grad school, these were the kinds of questions I was very interested in. And I have this image here as a reminder to me, to remind you, to let you know that some of the material that we're going to be covering here has very heavy, sobering themes. We will see some imagery related to violence as well. So I just want you to be aware that that's what we're going to be heading into. So you do have a choice. You don't have to sit and watch or be part of the lecture, but if you do remain and you are interested, then you're going to dive down this rabbit hole with me. Right? So you'll be taking that blue, I think it's not the blue pill, but the red pill. If I remember the movie correctly, The Matrix. Thank you. So this is a rabbit hole I've been wandering around for most of my life. I've been interested in this topic from a variety of standpoints that started off in international relations theory and political science, and eventually I landed on anthropology and archaeology. So this is going to cover a variety of perspectives, very superficially because we don't have that much time. But I hope to introduce you to some of the ideas that anthropologists have regarding this topic. And to begin with, one of the first exercises we might have is how to actually conceptualize the phenomenon. How do we define war? One thing we might do is, and I often start some of these talks this way, is I ask the audience to think about war. If you were to close your eyes and imagine what it looks like, what jumps into your vision? What kind of imagery do you see? For some people, it might be something like this. This would be the aftermath of World War I. This is in Europe, in Belgium, 1918. And we are confronted with this imagery of destruction, of the aftermath, the toll of violence that it has on life, on limbs, on infrastructure, on societies. And when we see these kinds of events happening in the modern context, this is not very long ago, it makes us wonder how far back in time we go. The historians can tell you that as far back as we've been writing anything, recording history, we can see descriptions related to violence and warfare. We can see it in text, we can see it depicted, whether we're in Cambodia, Angkor, or we're going back to Southwest Asia several millennia ago in Mesopotamia. We can see images of conflict. This is a very famous artifact known as the Narmer Palette, and it dates to about 5,100 years ago. And depicted on this particular artifact are it's two sides of the palette. And what you can see here is this mythical, or maybe a historical figure known as Narmer, wielding an instrument of power, a mace. And depicted on these two faces are images of sieges, potentially against fortified cities. We see armies, we see prisoners, we see people that have been killed in conflict. This, for some people, represents the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. And there are questions about the relationship between conflict and warfare and the formation of states and the maintenance of states. One question we might ask is, based on all of this evidence we are faced with, has warfare always been a part of our humanity's history, of our species? The twin question we might ask is, why should we care to begin with? If we consider that first war, we know that at the end of it, we have various efforts to try to ensure that it doesn't happen again. We can talk about the League of Nations being established. And despite those efforts, we know that World War II happens. On the heels of that, we have the United Nations. And despite our best efforts, we still see security being a very significant concern for the modern nation state system. So the UN tells you, right, that it comes into existence because following the Second World War, there had to be a mission to maintain international peace and security. And despite our best efforts, we can look at the Cold War period in the 20th century and the number of major wars that continue to happen regardless, despite our efforts. And some would argue that the only reason World War III has not happened is because of nuclear weapons. The presence of these weapons that for the first time in our species history, we have the capability of destroying the entire planet, all of us. And perhaps that is the only reason why we have not seen World War III. Although what's happening currently in Ukraine can be a source of concern for many of us. If we go back, we can also think about changes within the same geographic space. So if we go back to Cambodia and to Angkor, this is several centuries ago, but it's kind of instructive to consider conflict as it has evolved in these geographic locations. If we move forward into the 20th century, we can think about all the ordnance that was dropped on parts of Cambodia by the United States and by all of the other kinds of munitions that were used. This particular graphic I find fascinating and very sobering because we can see that depending on where some of these bombs were dropped, they either detonated or they didn't. And the ones that did not still continue to plague the people that live in these environments, their ability to exist, to farm. And if we consider also the legacies of militarization and of conflict, it's not just the bombs that were dropped, but we can consider all of the conflicts, the turmoil that happened during the 20th century, the landmines that were placed within the country that still echo, that persist in terms of legacies, and that still affect people that were not even born when these mines were placed into these environments, who are now affected still. This is a part of daily life. To me, this illustrates the enormous cost, the toll that these kinds of actions can have on societies. We consider all of the resources, all of the money, all of the lives, the infrastructures, the public health of our societies, all of that having been impacted by our decisions. The effects can continue, they can echo for generations. Seeing all of this around us has prompted all kinds of studies from a variety of disciplines, whether we're looking at political science, IR theory, evolutionary psychology, anthropology, you name it. Like I said in the beginning, everybody has an opinion. And I started studying this from a particular lens, a political science lens. And one of my advisors, or my instructors at the time, this was on the East Coast, this is Jack Levy from Rutgers University. He co-authored a book a few years ago called The Arc of War, where he was moving back beyond the modern nation state system, so into the deeper past. And he was speculating a little bit about the origins of conflict. And he and his co-author offered some ideas about this. But one of the things that I want to point out is they acknowledged this need to dive deeper into the past and to explore some of these earlier contexts. And I won't read the entire quote here, but I'll just highlight the significance here is how war originates and how it has evolved, the kinds of institutions and processes involved in its change over time. This is what gets it squarely into the domain of anthropology and archaeology specifically, because without those kinds of lenses, it's very difficult to comment on that longer term trajectory, which gets us into this next part, anthropological views. So if you were to look at the Oxford English Dictionary at the term war itself, you might see this definition: hostile contention by means of armed forces carried on between nations, states, and rulers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you go to the Webster Dictionary, you see something somewhat similar: a state of usually open and declared armed hostile conflict as between states and nations. And one of the things that I would point out, and I talk to students about this, and oftentimes they see this very, very clearly as well, is there are some problems that we might point out with these kinds of definitions. They imply something. They talk about states and various kinds of nations. And then what you might see is a sort of bias in terms of what constitutes war. Are we suffering from recency bias? If we define warfare in this fashion, does it run the risk of trivializing that other forms of conflict that other kinds of societies might be engaged with, the kinds of decisions that they make, the kinds of conditions that they face, the choices that they have? And if that's the case, if it starts to gloss over some of these other cases and histories, what we are doing is restricting the database. If we truly want to understand the phenomenon, we have to broaden our perspective so that we can see various forms, various manifestations, if you want to have a more holistic perspective. The other thing that this definition implies is that war might be recent, because as we know, for the vast majority of human history, we did not live in states. We didn't live in these larger social political entities. So for a broader understanding, for an understanding of changes over time, we have to broaden our definition. I've actually seen papers that refer to warfare and the study of warfare from a very narrow perspective. Some authors will tell you, well, unless it satisfies a minimum threshold of 1,000 battle fatalities, then we're not going to study it. It doesn't qualify as war. So this is not part of our database to examine. For me, having a more inclusive perspective might be more productive as we answer these early questions. So Bronislaw Malinowski offered a definition back in the 1930s where he talked about the use of organized force between politically independent units. Something along those lines I find more productive as a starting point, right? This is not the definition we need to have, but it is one that probably is useful if we're going to explore these questions. In a recent paper, anthropologist Brian Ferguson published a paper on war and whether or not it's part of human nature. And one of the things he asks is it innate to our species? Or does it emerge at some point in time? Do we learn it? Do we adopt it as a behavior? And perhaps if we did, when would that be? Under what kinds of conditions? I'm going to paraphrase here, but he essentially argues that it is the latter, that we do adopt it, that it's learned, it comes about, given certain kinds of cultural conditions. And for him and for many researchers, the answer lies within the Holocene. It is when we start to become sedentary, when we start to live in these more complex societies, quote unquote, complex civilizations or states, where we have farming and other kinds of behaviors. That's where warfare may be starting. That's one opinion or one set of opinions. So in that kind of perspective, this is kind of relatively recent origins for the onset of warfare. And it's connected to some of the earliest states, civilizations, and it's connected to the mid-Holocene. Some of you may be familiar with the archaeological studies of folks like B. Gordon Child and others who within the mid-20th century talked about some of the classic cases of the earliest civilizations in the world, so-called pristine states. And there's a handful of them. And for many people, perhaps that's where the origins are. Once we start to see these kinds of societies, that's probably when, according to this perspective, we see warfare, true warfare. It's linked to sedentism, it's linked to farming, it's linked to growing populations. And the argument here is that before we have these kinds of settings, it's too costly. No one is incentivized to make that investment, to decide to fight. That in these kinds of smaller scale settings, if there is trouble, it's easier to just pick up and leave to avoid the conflict altogether. So there is this kind of debate, this dichotomy, and it's a crude dichotomy. This is a very crude graphic that I have up here, but I have it here to kind of illustrate the divergent perspectives that we might talk about. Some talk about this long and short chronology, and within it, you might have various opinions. Some say that those who see a longer chronology are the so-called hawks. Some that see a more recent chronology are the so-called doves. But I have to say that even within this dichotomy, there are gradations. There are all kinds of arguments within that, and they have to do with different interpretations of data, different ideas about the cases, and of course, different points in human history and changes in our biological evolution, as well as our social evolution. So whether we're talking about battle fatalities numbering 1,000 or more, or we're talking about ancient sedentism and farming, domestication, or some people will argue war goes even further back, as we'll talk about today. This is an image from a film called Dead Birds. This is a documentary that was produced by an anthropologist back in the 1960s. And it chronicles some of the lifeways of the Dani in New Guinea, Papua New Guinea. And what's interesting about this is there are depictions of ritualized battle within the documentary occurring between some of these groups. And one of the things that we might point out is how, based on these kinds of ethnographic descriptions and depictions, there has been a tendency for people to see warfare as an analogy. If you examine ethnographic examples and try to imagine what our ancestors in non-state societies may have lived like, what kinds of conflict they would have engaged in, perhaps it's very closely approximates these kinds of behaviors. And so it's led to this idea of ritualized or game-like or trivial forms of conflict. And this is something that my late advisor, Larry Keeley, was upset about, because he said, these conventional views are assumptions. We are assuming that their forms of conflict would have been just like this. And we are assuming that their forms of conflict would have been game-like, tribal, or primitive. And he critiqued this and said that perhaps we should be looking at other kinds of data sets. And perhaps if you examine not only the ethnographic record, but the archaeological record, you start to see that those ideas that only states engage in war, that they are not supported by the data, that all kinds of societies may be possible in participating. The forms might be different, but the kinds of motivations that people have, the kinds of effects that there might be, can be very significant, and the motivations can be very similar, which takes us to the exploration of that past. So one analogy I have here is the title is Plumbing Nebulous Depths. So we're going to examine what is in the murky depths below. If you don't like that analogy, another one that I have here that students enjoy is we will jump into our DeLorean and go back in time. So we will go from place to place. And the very first stop for us is Germany. Germany at around 1200 BCE. This is the Talents River Valley. And there is the Talents River. We are looking at a site that was detected very recently. And coming out of the riverbank are human remains, equipment, artifacts, the remains of horses. And there's a picture that comes to us regarding what might have been happening here. This is 1200 BCE. This is the Bronze Age of this part of the world. This is around the same time, if you know Herodotus and the descriptions about Troy, that's supposedly happening at around the same time. So we know about classical descriptions of warfare in other parts of Europe. But this is completely unexpected, or was completely unexpected. There's no writing here. There'd be no writing here for many, many centuries later. And this event is not documented in any history book. But what we can see from the archaeological record is very, very telling. Not only do we see the remains coming up, but we see evidence of trauma. We see the paraphernalia, the equipment used to cause the trauma, to cause those injuries. By all indication, it appears that only a fraction of the site has been excavated so far. So there are probably more materials, more human remains that are still out there. And it appears that a lot of the implements are part of equipment for specialized classes of people who were here to fight. This is not just a part-time farmer who picked up a farming implement and decided to engage in conflict. It looks like they are professional individuals who are outfitted for conflict. And the isotopic evidence suggests that they potentially are coming from very far away. This is not a local event. There are people that are coming from very far away across parts of Europe, converging in this one location. And here we have this area of Central Europe. You can see where Collins Valley is located. This is probably some kind of event. Maybe it's one single event, and it's not an accumulation of materials over decades or centuries. And the suspicion by some of the researchers that maybe thousands were involved, given the numbers that we do see right now. And here's a quote by one of the researchers. They had considered various scenarios of raids in small groups, maybe stealing food, but something like this, a battle concerning thousands of people, it's a complete shock. At 1200 BCE, if we move to the other side of Eurasia, to areas of East Asia, the Bronze Age parts of China, for instance, what's known as the Shang Dynasty. This is an artifact from the Shang Dynasty. It is an oracle bone. It's used in divination rituals and practices, and it's part of what's known as the Shang civilization, maybe the first dynasty of ancient Chinese history. And we know that the Shang had different capital cities. The capital would move over time. And the last capital of the Shang was a place called Inshu. And there was a royal cemetery associated with this capital city. And if you look in the royal cemetery and in some of the excavations, you can see vast amounts of wealth associated with different classes of people. And some of these burials, some of these tombs have evidence of ritual sacrifice, individuals that were killed and placed into the tombs with their main occupants, whole chariots placed into these mortuary settings with the horses, the chariot drivers. We know that thousands of people had been sacrificed over the course of Inshu's couple of centuries of history, in addition to animals. These sacrifices might be in mortuary context. They might be used to commemorate construction projects, maybe to consecrate construction efforts. But I have this here because for me, it's interesting to think about how in this early state level society, war is used, violence is used as an apparatus, as a kind of instrument. But it also illustrates to us the cultural variability when it comes to logic and attitudes about violence. This may seem completely foreign and abhorrent to us in 21st century Western society, but it might have made perfect sense to the people living at that time in these areas. It also suggests, too, very intimate connections between political power, government, authority, religion, and practices of violence. Right? These can tell us something about human nature as well. Let's go further back in time. So let's jump back into our time machine, go back to Germany, but now instead of 1200 BCE, we're going back to 7,000 years ago. This is a site known as the Halberstadt site, and this is from the Neolithic of Germany. And we have here what appears to be some kind of massacre, a mass burial of many individuals who were subjected to violence. There are fractures at the time of death. They are placed into this context where it's haphazard. This is not typical of the burial practices, of the mortuary practices for this community. And we do see what the researchers describe as postmortem neglect. We have animal damage subsequent to the trauma that they sustained from other people. And by all accounts, it appears that this is a village that was attacked. Perhaps there were people that were killed in public. And what's interesting about this as well is this is part of what's known as the linear band Kermit society, so LBK. These are some of the earliest farming societies found anywhere in Europe. And this particular case is one out of several. Towards the end of the LBK period, we see a number of sites, a number of villages that were fortified, palisade walls and exterior ditches with signs of attack, signs of potential massacre around them or within them as well. So that takes us at 7,000 years ago. This is well before so-called civilization. This is well before some of the earliest cities that we see anywhere. There are no cities to speak of in Europe at this time. And it's debatable if we even see cities, depending on your definition of cities, anywhere else in the world. And we can go even further back. So this is another case that comes to us from Kenya. This is the Nadaruk site in West Turkana. We're looking at a site next to an ancient lagoon. This is about 10,000 years ago. And we have several individuals, at least 24 individuals. There are some debates about the chronology and whether or not this is a contemporaneous event, but the authors, the researchers who excavated this, their interpretation is that several of these individuals were all in the same event. We have women, we have men. There is one individual who a woman who may have been pregnant who was killed as well. We have signs of trauma on the bodies. In some places we can see fractures, we can see obsidian blades or points still embedded in the bone. And this is 10,000 years ago. And what's telling about this is at 10,000 years ago, there are no states, there are no cities, nothing like that. There is no domestication in this part of the world. We are looking at hunting and gathering societies in this particular context. It's also suggested that if we're looking at a contemporaneous event of a couple dozen people that were killed, it's likely that the attacking group far outnumbered this particular group. And the materials that appear to be used in that attack seem to have come from somewhere else. The geochemical signatures suggest a distant source. And the upshot of this, of course, is that practices of violence then are not restricted to states. They're not restricted to the mid-Holocene at 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. We see evidence predating that. And it makes us wonder, what about earlier? That takes us to the next part of the lecture. So we've kind of gone through and established that perhaps we are looking not in the last few centuries, not in the last few thousand years, but what about the murkier, deeper past? What can we say about that, and how? How can we see evidence of that? So you could tell from the Matrix image, I love movies. I'm sure you recognize this film. So this is that iconic opening sequence from 2001, A Space Odyssey. But we have that sequence where we see the hominids interacting. At one point, there's a skirmish that happens. One of them picks up a bone and wields it as a weapon. And of course, this is 2001, A Space Odyssey. So Kubrick, actually, interestingly enough, I think, was acquainted with various screenwriters who were very well acquainted with anthropology. So Robert Ardrey, for instance, was a screenwriter who was very well aware of some of the literature, such as the anthropological views on the killing ape hypothesis. And it's very possible that some of those views kind of put into the popular imagination ideas about our bloody past. And if you think about that scene, that hominid throws that bone up into the air, and then it transforms into this space vessel. And maybe there's a message hidden in there, right, about how our evolutionary arc, how we advance through time, perhaps from that bloody past, perhaps from that use of violence, right up until the future. What was the future? And it raises larger questions then about nature versus nurture and whether or not we've evolved. Is this depiction accurate? Are we naturally or innately violent as a species? That's a very big question, and I don't have an answer. But what I'll tell you is, I think it's a little bit of both. You cannot make this dichotomy. I think it's a very spurious dichotomy to make, to say that there is an opposition, a natural state for humanity of being warlike or peaceful. Even the ideas of war and peace themselves, which we can talk about, they're very complicated notions. But if we were to explore this in depth and to think about it, that story of early humanity has a very big cast of characters. And our ideas about their behavior come to us from a few different sources or methods or frameworks. One of those frameworks would be the fossil record. What can we see from their remains? It would come from the material record, the kinds of tools that are surviving in the archaeological record that they produce that we can study. But it also comes from primatological data, from analogies. What do we see with primates, living primates, that might give us an inkling, a window into our earlier past? So let's very briefly talk about some of these. From that Pleistocene record, if we wanted to explore questions that go beyond the Holocene, there are scant fragmentary clues that do come to us. One example might be this skull from Sterkfontein. We have a site in South Africa. The context is about 2 million years ago. And what we see here are striations, cut marks on the cheekbone that appear to have been placed here through use of a cutting tool, of a stone tool that was used. We have similar marks from the Bodo cranium. This is 600,000 years ago in Ethiopia. Also, very clearly, you can see the cut marks on the bone. All of this suggests that there is defleshing that's happening here through the use of stone tools. Someone is using a tool to do this. For some people, maybe this is indicative of violence. Maybe it's indicative of cannibalism. That's quite possible. But I would also argue that it could be anything. Maybe it's a ritual of some kind. Maybe this is how you treat your loved one when they pass on. Maybe it's anatomical curiosity. We can't rule any of that out because we simply don't have enough data. The cultural context is missing. Some of you may know this other case. We are in Spain, in the Atapuerca Mountains. This is a context from around 800,000 years ago. It's associated with a population known as Homo antecessor. This is in the Gran Dolina site. And we have here evidence of cannibalism. And it's very clear because we have remains of Homo antecessor that's commingled in context with prey items, butchered animals. And they're all in the same context. And the authors who studied this have argued that it shows human consumption of others, right? That it can be frequent, that it happened in this context. And they identified it as an example, a very early example of culinary cannibalism. That research is fairly compelling. And what's interesting about this is it has prompted some people to look at this case and to speculate. So Keith Otterbein wrote in 2011, based on this find, that perhaps we are looking at the earliest evidence for warfare in human history. If we can show that one group is targeting another group, bringing them back and then cannibalizing them, maybe we're looking at the earliest evidence of warfare. I'm not sure I would go that far. I would say it's quite possible if you do see that behavior happening. But the problem is we don't know for sure if it's happening. If we define warfare as one community against another, and if we can show that one community is targeting another, perhaps there's something that we can be saying about this. But we don't have quite enough information for that larger cultural context. Is it deliberate killing of one group against another? Potentially, but we don't have enough evidence. So for me, this is quite ambiguous. We think about artifacts as well. So we looked at the fossil record. We have artifacts like this. This is known as the Clacton spear. This is an artifact, this is the tip of a spear. And this particular artifact was found in the UK, and it dates to about 420,000 years ago. And if you're interested, there are lots of studies about artifacts like this, about these early forms of implements, spears and hunting implements or weapons. Anamika Milks and others have written extensively about this. And she actually uses ethnographic analogies to kind of explore the various contexts within which these kinds of implements can be used for hunting practices. But what's interesting about this also is we know that humans have been hunting megafauna for as long as we've had these implements, and probably for even longer than that, using other kinds of perishable materials or ambiguous kinds of artifacts. There was a time where we thought that some of our tool uses were very indicative and restricted to humans only, until we saw research by primatologists like Jane Goodall observing chimpanzees, for instance, using reeds and sticks to fish termites out of these termite mounds. The creation of a tool to produce food or to obtain food. So this was observed by Goodall decades ago. And very recently, and some of you may know this, in Senegal, at the site of Fangoli, chimpanzees were observed to do something different, not just fishing for termites, but in this particular area, researchers observed chimpanzees taking branches, sticks, and sharpening the ends using their teeth to fashion these points. Then they would take the sticks, go to the tree hollows where they knew that bush babies were sleeping, and jab inside to hunt and consume the bush babies. So we see these kinds of hunting behaviors and the uses of tools, of material culture for those practices. We also know that chimpanzees can engage in forms of coalitionary violence. So there was a very interesting study that was done over about a decade in Uganda, at the Kibale National Park, where chimpanzees were observed. For the bulk of the time, we don't see violence, we don't see group violence, but on occasion, on many occasions, the males were observed to get up occasionally and walk out in single file line and start patrolling the outskirts of their territory. And when they came across a lone chimpanzee from the neighboring community, sometimes they would attack, they would kill that chimpanzee. And we have seen then this kind of coalitionary behavior using violence. And some have argued that perhaps there is something analogous to the kinds of raiding behaviors that we see with human societies. And this has led to various arguments about this, about if chimpanzees behave this way, and if we behave this way, and if we share the last common ancestor several million years ago, it stands to reason that our last common ancestor may have behaved this way as well. And there are research studies and arguments made by folks like primatologist Richard Wrangham about this kind of lineage and this behavior. And perhaps, as argued by some, we have evolved to become this way. There's been a genetic biological predisposition that favored that kind of behavior, that allowed that kind of success to happen, so that we are the outcome of that biological change that's happened over the course of millions of years. Now, on the surface, I would say that that's a very interesting and compelling argument. We can see chimpanzees behaving this way. We know we behave this way, and there are analogies, to be sure. But whether or not that is the most parsimonious explanation, I don't know. I don't quite agree. I think that there are different ideas that we should also be thinking about. One is we also see a lot of peaceful behavior, nonviolent behavior among chimpanzees that get overshadowed by these kinds of conversations. We also know that chimpanzees are not the only reference. We know that there are over 100 different primate species. Very closely related bonobos, for instance, do not exhibit the same kinds of behaviors that chimpanzees do. So we can question how accurate the analogy might be, or how appropriate the analogy with chimpanzees might be. The other thing that I would point out is, even if we see it with chimpanzees, it doesn't, at least for me, approximate the kinds of things we might attribute to human forms of violence. Chimpanzees might fight for resources or for territory, but we fight for all kinds of reasons, and I'll get into that in just a second. But the other thing that I would also point out as problematic is this idea about males. Warfare, if we want to define it in however way we want to, is not restricted to males. This is something that I think there is a sort of stereotypical biased view that has kind of seeped into our Western perception or notions of violence, and it has remained. But that's something else that I would point out is somewhat problematic. And let me talk about a few of these aspects very briefly. These are daggers from Papua New Guinea. This is from the ethnographic record. They're bone daggers. They're made from cassowary, a kind of bird, the thigh bone, as well as human thigh bone. And there is a paper that talked about this, that some of these bones were used, these daggers were used for close combat, but they're also used for symbolic purposes, for display of power, of status. And one of the authors of this particular study, this ethnographic study, was talking about how maybe you source that material from an ancestor or your grandfather or somebody and fashion it into this dagger, because it was like taking that person with you into battle, having the spirit of that person, the aura, taking that with you. And for me, this is important because you can think about the fundamental aspects that separate our forms of violence with the other forms that we see in the natural world. We connect our cultures to these forms of practice. Our ideas, we imbue meaning, symbolic thought into these aspects. And if that is the case, we can talk about ideas related to our own belief systems and our forms of cognition and communication. And I'll return to that in just a second. I don't know if you know this story. This is a gentleman by the name of Hiroru Onoda, who was one of the last Japanese holdouts from World War II. So he was stationed in the Philippines. And when World War II ends, a lot of Japanese soldiers surrendered or went home. And he was one of the few that did not. He refused to believe that the war was over. Leaflets were dropped from planes, explaining to people that were still in the jungles that the war was over. But he was given an order from his commanding officer. Before the commanding officer left, he was told, don't surrender, don't take your own life, keep fighting. And he considered it an honor to continue to do that, and that it would be dishonorable to give up. And so he fought or stayed in the jungles for 29 years. The urban legend is there was a Japanese tourist who knew about him and then went to the Philippines, actually located him, and then went back to Japan to find his commanding officer, brought the commanding officer back out to the Philippines, who then told him, you are relieved, you can come home now. So this is an image of him surrendering his sword to President Ferdinand Marcos in 1974. But again, this highlights that human cultural dimension, the ideas that we fight for. If we go back to China, this is 2300 BCE. And this is a site known as Shimao. And at this particular site, this is located not far from Beijing, we have a city, an ancient city that is walled. We see clear fortifications at this site, bastions, watchtowers, screened, baffled gates entering into the main entrance, this palatial area up on an elevated position. And what's interesting here is two aspects of the site. The first is we have evidence of skull pits on the outside, human sacrifice. We have dozens and dozens of individuals that have been sacrificed and placed into these skull pits. Some kind of ritual ceremony, we're not sure exactly what. But the other thing that's interesting is the presence of jade artifacts that were embedded into the outside, the exterior parts of the wall. And some argue that perhaps they are apotropaic. They are there to protect against spiritual threat. So we can see this mixture of physical fortification features, defending against potential physical threat, but also there might be ideas about spiritual attack, shamans and other kinds of magic that might cause harm to the inhabitants of the town. We're speculating, of course, but perhaps that might be the reason why we see these other kinds of practices. And it highlights, once again, that cultural dimension of conflict and warfare. It's something that archaeologists tend to stay away from because it's very difficult for us to get into the heads and understand the ideological systems of these past societies. But I would argue that it should not be ignored. We have to acknowledge that they had these belief systems, and the more we can be innovative in how we approach these questions, the more we can test these kinds of hypotheses. The other thing I want to point out here is this is now in the same part of the world. It's a little bit later. This is back to Inshu, the Shang dynasty. This is the tomb of a particular individual by the name of Fu Hao. This was a warrior, a general, and a shaman but this was a woman. Many people, when you think about those terms, at least in American culture, we start to think male. We don't assume female. But we can point to many instances in history, in Vietnam specifically. We can point to the story of the Chung Sisters, who led a rebellion against the Han Empire. They were generals that led this uprising in the first century of the Common Era. On the other side, in Europe, in the UK, we have stories of Boudica, who led an uprising against the Roman Empire in the same century. I think they were separated by a couple of decades. Anybody heard of the Burqa warrior? This is a Viking burial. So this is from about 1,000 years ago in Sweden. This is a burial that was uncovered maybe a century ago. It is viewed as the quintessential Viking warrior burial. We have the remains of horses, of weapons, of gaming pieces that probably are related to strategy and leadership. And for the longest time, it was held up as this quintessential Viking burial, probably male or assumed to be male. Researchers recently analyzed the DNA and realized actually we're looking at a female. And what's interesting about this, at least from my perspective, is when they published those findings, researchers critiqued and said, are you sure you interpreted your results correctly? Are you sure you did this correctly? They refused to accept the possibility that this was a woman. So they had to defend their perspective. They had to defend their argument. But that, again, goes against this assumption about binaries and ideas of gender related to warfare. But I want to start moving into this last part of the lecture, and this is admittedly very speculative, right? So people want to know, when does war start? If we go back to that question, what do these data sets tell us? Many years ago, President Obama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and he offered a speech at the end when he was accepting the award. And I have an excerpt here. And what's interesting, I won't read the whole thing, but he talks about war itself and his views. And I think it shows us how he sees it. And there's this very key part where he says war in one form or another originates with first man. Now, I'm assuming he means the first humanity, first bit of humanity, not specifically male. But the question we might ask is that accurate? Does it appear with the first man? And I suppose it means, or it depends on what we mean by war and what we mean by the first inklings of humanity. And it takes us back to that original question that we set out with when we dropped into this rabbit hole. Has it always been a part of humanity? The evidence is suggestive, but it's not definitive, especially when we go very far back in time. So for me, some of those cases where we see within the Holocene do suggest that we cannot restrict warfare to states or to complex societies or to farming societies. We see enough evidence suggesting that it is something that all kinds of societies are capable of. But how far back it goes is debatable, because the further back we go in time, the more patchy, fuzzier that evidence becomes. Actually, the evidence for anything becomes fuzzier the further back we go in time. And the issue, as we've seen, is we don't have a lot of social data, context. So how do we separate homicide from warfare? How do we separate funerary practice? How do we separate accidental death or accidental injuries versus intentional ones? All of that is very difficult to parse through. But what I would say is there is enough here to suggest that we cannot assume one or another. So it is, I think, a disservice to assume that there was an absence of war simply because we don't see the evidence for it. Rather than asking or starting with that assumption, we might be saying, what evidence can we find? How do we find it? Which also raises the question that perhaps we're asking the wrong question. So instead of thinking about when warfare begins, or is it always a part of humanity? Has it always been? Maybe one thing we might be asking is, when did we become human? And what I mean by this is, if we consider warfare as a form of activity, a behavior that requires cooperation, it is not the opposite. There is no dichotomy between competition and cooperation. Warfare is a form of competition, but it is a form of competition that requires cooperation. It is one group working very closely with one another, shared objectives, shared goals that is directed against another group or another set of groups. And that requires very complex forms of sociality, of identity formation, of cooperation. I mentioned before that it's highly cultural, this context of warfare. So we can think about all of the meanings, the symbols, the motivations, the ideas of fighting for an idea or for a community identity, subjecting yourself to danger, potentially to death, for something that you believe in. And maybe to protect people that are not biologically related to you, but that are part of your larger group. That kind of thinking, arguably, comes about when we start to identify the world in this way, when we see our social world in this way, when we start to identify forms of fictive kinship ties, where we're not just talking about people that are biologically close to us in terms of relationships, and maybe when we start to identify ourselves in certain ways. One possibility too is that we are able to complexly communicate with one another. We can compel each other and motivate one another. This is the reason why our group needs to fight that group, because the gods want us to do this. I can explain this to everyone else in my community. If we don't do this, we will be punished, right? Or they are causing illness and we have to stop that from happening. All kinds of ideas. And if we accept that possibility, then we start to look at the archaeological record for when we start to see that kind of complex cognition and symbolic thinking. We can see signs of anatomical modern human anatomy as early as 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. We can start to see forms of complex behavior being reflected by the archaeological record by things like this, ornaments on beads or necklaces potentially, going back to 150,000 years ago, suggesting the possibility that we have expressions of identity, whether it's for an individual's identity or maybe even for the group. And if that's happening, perhaps there are ways to identify your group versus a different group. And it's not just a matter of thinking about it, but it's a matter of displaying it as well. So the question of when did we become human, not only physically, biologically, but also behaviorally. We can point to things like Chauvet Cave, the Upper Pleistocene, Upper Paleolithic, some 35,000 years ago, cave paintings that people see in France on walls. We can look at pieces of ochre with engraving marks on them from South Africa. This is the Blombos Cave at 75,000 years ago. And we can talk about suites of behavior that go very far back that suggest these forms of symbolic thought and cognition. This is just a hypothesis and we need more evidence. But if we see behavioral modernity, quote unquote, behavioral modernity as early as 200,000 years ago, perhaps we might be seeing elements of group on group competition just as early as that. So if we had to speculate, and this is what my colleague and I do at the end of our argument, we speculate that if you wanted to put any kind of time frame on this for what we might call socially cooperative violence, we go back to that crude graphic, for us, it would be somewhere there. Doesn't mean that it happened all the time. It doesn't mean that we were naturally violent or that we had this propensity for violence. And it doesn't mean that it propelled us biologically to evolve in that way. But it does open the possibility that if you find evidence, it should not surprise you. If you find evidence from that time period, it shouldn't surprise you. That this kind of behavioral modernity opened up the door for collective violence. But the other thing we argue is the argument is more complex than that. It is not when we became violent, it is when we became cooperative. And that opened up the door for all kinds of behaviors across a suite of possibilities. So this idea of behavioral modernity, it also allowed for what we consider to be plasticity in behavior. We can be extremely cooperative for violence targeted against others, or we can be very creative in how to avoid violence. So this emergence of warfare is a twin question with the emergence of peacefare. When we started to learn how to avoid conflict, how to use elements of empathy and sociality, that is at the heart of these behaviors. It runs both ways. And perhaps all the research that we continue to do along these lines of empathy or sociality, of altruism, those kinds of studies are just as important for us to understand the origins of war, right? So this twin concept of warfare and peacefare. that would be very important to consider in ongoing research. I'm going to wrap up here with a couple of images because this is a very sobering topic, and I don't want to end on the very pessimistic views about the antiquity of violence and warfare. This is Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Vietnamese monk who promoted these notions of nonviolence. He passed away very recently. I think it was January of just this year that he passed away. But he was exiled from the country of Vietnam decades ago, and he traveled the world. And I think behind the Dalai Lama, he's one of these more famous Buddhists. And he actually met Martin Luther King Jr. in Chicago back in the 1960s. And Dr. King nominated him for a Nobel Peace Prize, saying that he was more worthy of the prize than most, maybe anyone that he knew. And I think a lot of his ideas about nonviolence and its application to the conflict in Vietnam actually influenced Dr. King, who I think not long after this meeting came out against the war in Vietnam or American involvement in it. And I have this here because I'm thinking about this idea of nonviolence itself. I don't know if anybody's ever been here or recognizes this location. This is in Atlanta. This is Ebenezer Church. This is where Dr. King started giving his sermons as an early young minister. If you go there now, I got to visit this a few years ago. It's managed by the National Park Service. They have on the loudspeaker Dr. King's sermons playing, and it's kind of a surreal experience to walk into this environment to hear his voice. And right across the street from the church is the Nonviolence Center dedicated to Dr. King's life. And it's a sort of museum. And if you walk into that main entrance, you're confronted with this quote from King. It's no longer a choice between violence and nonviolence, either nonviolence or non-existence. And for me, encapsulated in that idea, that notion, is this idea that we do have choice. If we think about complex cooperation, that was one of the key building blocks for human cultural evolutionary changes that were happening in the distant past. And it opened up all kinds of possibilities for us to participate in the most abhorrent forms of interaction, but also in the most beautiful forms as well. And it speaks to this kind of choice. And understanding that, I think, this kind of study is empowering. It enables us to understand the kinds of conditions and circumstances that lead to choices that we make. Why are we more prone to certain kinds of behaviors given the right circumstances versus others? And if we can start to understand those conditions and why we react the way that we do, why we make decisions the way that we do, it tells us about the mutability of cultural values. What we consider to be peace might be different from one person to the next. What is just or unjust can be at the heart of that as well. And all of that then tells us about how it takes human imagination and willingness to act on that imagination to produce the kinds of outcomes that we agree upon. Right? It's all possible. So if there's anything that we can take away from, I hope, this message, that it would be that last one. Right? And I'll end here, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you. Yes.
I guess it kind of touches on the last thing you were talking about. Do you feel like there are, or can you say that there are nonviolent forms of warfare, like economic or?
Yeah. Again, it depends on your definition of warfare, if you want to include forms of physical violence and harm in that definition or not. But if you're talking about a more generic perspective on forms of competition that can cause harm in some way, maybe it's not physical injury, but maybe there are other forms of harm. Yeah, I would say that there are other forms that we can discuss. There are forms of structural violence and cultural violence that may not be obvious. They may not lead to overt forms of physical attack and injury, but they can cause harm to populations or groups of people. There could be forms of economic violence or economic competition. And, some societies will tell you that they're all part of a suite of behaviors or strategies. Sometimes we will attack you to prevent you from competing with us economically. Sometimes we'll attack your infrastructure to to prevent you from competing with us. But it's all part of the same larger strategy, right? It's just different means. So that's how I would approach that question. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, that's it's sort of two-parter.
Yeah.
On that basis, then, do you think that that kind of warfare, that nonviolent, like specifically more focused than on that, like when we start to see states form in that kind, or do you think that we could potentially see that earlier when we're before non-sedentary?
That kind of conflict, you mean?
Mhm.
When we start to see it?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I have not really thought about that. If I had to speculate, I would say I don't think it's restricted to states. I think that we tend to see a lot of things attached to states, but if we thought about it, we can see forms of those behaviors that are attached to all kinds of societies. And I wouldn't discriminate against other kinds of communities and their ability to engage in practices that might be economically motivated, that might target infrastructure, or that might prevent people from accessing certain resources, for instance. That I don't think is restricted to the state. Maybe the state takes these behaviors to a different scale, at a different level. They can employ larger sets of resources, larger numbers in organizing to do those kinds of things. But they're not the only ones that are capable or have the ideas to do it or have the motivation to do it. At least that's how I would argue. Sure.
Yeah, so I think at the end, a very, very great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
At the end of the part, you mentioned that I think you emphasize about the complex cooperation.
Yeah.
We might think complex cooperation is as good side, but actually when we really think about the historical development of complex cooperation has led to helping each other, but also led to really excluding what we define as abstract others.
Yes.
So how would you then, how this archaeological studies of warfare can contribute to answer that?
That's a good question. So the way I would answer that is there when my late mentor published that book in 1996, he was railing against this, what he called the pacification of the past. He said people were seeing past the evidence and not recognizing the presence of warfare. So that kicked off a huge debate within archaeology, within Western archaeology, about the presence and absence of warfare in these earlier contexts. And so there was a lot of debate over the ensuing years, decades really, about presence and absence. For me, I think we've moved beyond that. I think the archaeological evidence is sufficient to say that warfare exists in various kinds of settings of the past, whether we're talking about civilizations or not. Now, I would argue that it has become more nuanced. There are not only there's not only the potential presence of warfare, but we have to start thinking about how it is connected to other aspects of lifeways. So, for example, we tend to think about discrete domains of behavior in societies. So there's the economic aspect or the religious one or the political one, et cetera, et cetera. But they're all connected. So if we think about our belief systems, who is acceptable as a trade partner, as a marriage partner? What's acceptable to eat? What's acceptable to exploit in the environment around us? There are ideological ideas about this, but they can spill over into our decisions about economics, into our decisions about the use of territory, into politics, and then into other aspects like competition over some of these resources. And who's acceptable as a target, who's deemed maybe subhuman or non-human. So all of these, I think, are connected. And if we start to accept that possibility, then perhaps the archaeological investigations can test these hypotheses. Is there a reason why this particular group trades with this group, but not this group? Even though they have mutually interchangeable materials that they need. It could be because we don't like each other. It could be because this group is an alliance that we need. So the economics that the archaeologist studies, we can say these materials come from this area, the styles are similar, the chemical composition shows this, but maybe we can start to ask deeper questions. Why? And if we see fortifications here, if we see iconography of militarism, we can start to piece together a larger social context. And I would argue too that the construction of peace tells you that people are trying to avoid it, right? So there is a reason why we establish economic interdependence, because in some ways we want to make sure there's stability. So it's not just a matter of economic need, but maybe it's to avoid competition that spills over into conflict. That could be another motivation. So I jumped on the soapbox with your question, and I think I answered more than maybe you were asking, but that's the kind of thinking that I have. That I think the archaeology needs to move into these other domains in the field. I don't know if that makes sense.
It really answers.
Okay.
So it's like kind of a very maybe dialectical, that there's a action and reaction.
Yeah.
Complex cooperation, but therefore complex cooperative violence. And then
Right.
warfare, and then as a reaction, try to avoid warfare, try to aim for the peace.
Yeah.
And then archaeological findings, like one time, really early potential evidence, some clear evidence can really change our views in what is violence and what is war,
Right.
what
Right.
is human nature.
Yeah. I think the bottom line is just to be curious and to ask that question, as opposed to assuming that it did not exist. If it did exist, how do we know? How can we find out?
Well, political science.
Yes.
So there's this famous thesis about war, create state,
Yes.
state make war, and so on. And I like the way you emphasize the collaboration part of it. And the political science thinking is that so war create more cohesive states because war destroy the weak states and the remaining state can become more cohesive. But you are making an argument that war also organized activity. That's why society undergoing war has to become more cohesive.
Right.
As part of it, so it's more like collaboration side of war rather than the competition side.
Yeah.
And I guess your response to the political science thesis would be, well, that may be true, but it may be irrelevant. Would you say that?
I'm not necessarily irrelevant, but I think that it is more complex than that thesis would convey. That kind of cooperation, I think, is the more telling aspect of human societies. And I've sat in on political science classes with professors, and we've asked them. I remember asking one of them. Actually, there were two professors that I had at undergrad, both political scientists, two different classes. One was on terrorism, one was on IR relations. And the one on IR relations was a professor who had worked for NASA. He was a political scientist and also worked for NASA. I remember asking, what would it take for world peace? And his answer was simple. He said, when the aliens come, that's when we'll have world peace. Because then we will have a collective need to work together and we have a common adversary. The other professor, the one who was teaching on terrorism, had a very different answer. when we asked what would it take for world peace, he said, "Oh, it's simple. You kill all the adults and you start over. You leave the kids." So I think that in those two perspectives, you can see elements of what we've been talking about today, right? Some of it maybe is the nurture aspect. We've learned, we've invented this behavior, these strategies, these institutions, and they've become very successful. And in the political IR perspective, that's the nature of the world system now. And with the security dilemma, this realist perspective, we're doomed. You cannot get rid of war now. But that was something that led me away because I was thinking, well, there are other motivations why. It's not an inevitability. It is something that we have learned to do, yes, but there are reasons why. And there are cultural motivations too. And for me, that was some of the interesting aspects that I wanted to study. So I don't know if I would say that negates that perspective. Wars make states and states make war. But I think it complicates the reasons why we see war. At least that's what I'm hoping the anthropology can do for us.
I have one question that's maybe a little bit speculative. So
Yeah.
I thought it was really I appreciated your kind of discussion at the end about gender and like we can't just say that this is male only. But since you've been surveying this with a broad perspective, do you see when we move forward in time that there are particularly gendered aspects to warfare that start becoming dominant? I guess I was trying to think like I think we can see individuals within societies that are otherwise patriarchal of women or female identifying somehow people who are involved in warfare, but then there's very few matriarchal societies. But I'm just wondering, like, I don't know if you've encountered anything that shows that they're also participating in warfare in the same way. I just think that was wondering if that's an interesting question. And honestly, I mean, you think about Dr. Martin Luther King and the Dalai Lama and these other, Buddhist monks, like those are patriarchal religions too. So they're still, they're espousing peace, but they're still participating in the repression of women.
Yeah.
Even in espousing peace. So I just feel like there is this gendered component to it. So it's not like women can't be participating in warfare, but there's something about patriarchal societies that I wonder if there's just something around. I don't know, not being very articulate.
No.
I'm just wondering if you've come across this as you've been thinking in this broad, big picture.
Right. It's hard to say. This is something that Mark and I are contemplating more and more, and it's something that we wish we had focused more on for the book. For us, we didn't think about it enough at the time, and admittedly so. We now realize this is a very important question that deserves a lot more attention. But I think the cursory surveys that we've done have shown us that it's a very complicated question because some of it might be related to what actually does exist in historical and archaeological and ethnographic records, but some of it might be based on the traditional conventional perspectives and the approaches that had been used to examine those records in the first place that self-fulfilled certain kinds of prophecies or conclusions, right? It reinforced these conclusions, these ideas that might not be accurate. So what we're hoping is that as we continue to explore, as we continue to question these assumptions, we'll find more evidence. I know that there's plenty of evidence. I only mentioned a couple here, but we can point to various archaeological cases as well as historical cases of participation across demographics. Doesn't matter, male, female, young, old, everyone in different aspects. And this gets at that earlier comment I made too about how warfare is not just a separate domain from society of study, but you can see aspects of it within various aspects of the tapestry of society. Preparations for conflict, post-conflict rituals, reintegrating people back into society. There are all kinds of activities that we did not talk about here. That we can talk about. So that is not restricted to one kind of identity or one kind of demographic group. It is something that involves everybody. So from that standpoint, I think we can approach these questions from a variety of perspectives and start to broaden our ideas.
That can be for the second edition.
Yeah, we are thinking about a book on peace,
Oh, yeah.
but that I think would be for the second edition.
Like jumpstart this whole thing, because I am wondering now in that context of like thinking about that Viking burial.
Yeah.
And the fact you mentioned that it took a DNA sample, a DNA analysis to tell a female individual. Has there ever been, or do you think there ever will be, an effort to bring in people like forensic anthropologists who can examine the skeletal remains and potentially identify the sexes of these individuals and war sites to see if maybe there are more women in settings than we previously assumed there would be?
I think that is happening. I don't know how widespread it is. That if it's a very difficult question to answer, because if we're talking about all of the archaeological sites around the world, archaeology is done very differently everywhere, and the kinds of assumptions that people have moving in, the kinds of techniques that people have for analysis and methodologies, it's going to be very, very different everywhere. So it's hard for me to comment on that. I do think, and I hope that as there's more and more of this kind of study and these kinds of questions that are being raised, like this particular case from Sweden with the Viking burial, that there's a greater awareness that you cannot make these a priori assumptions about anything, whether warfare existed or not, or who was participating. Let's start from a neutral standpoint. Maybe there was war, maybe not. And maybe war happened at different points in time. And if it did, then let's ask who was involved and how were they involved, as opposed to just assuming the only way you're going to see war is if you find a palisade wall or a body with trauma. And more often than not, that body is going to be a young male between the ages of 20 and 40, right? As opposed to assuming these kinds of starting points, let's examine as much of the data as we can. And my hope would be that you would involve other forms of expertise in approaching these materials.
So sorry I have to go, but thank you so much for the
Sure.
talk, and I pick you up at 7, right?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's 7.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you gonna meet at the?
At the hotel.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, well, that seems like a great place to end it. so
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.